International News Edition. His Majesty the King, the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, is updated on the Royal Air Force's training, operational and administrative programs. In a meeting with Germany's Defense Minister, the King says the world should stand united against terrorism and extremism. And France is stepping up security after the country's worst terrorism attacks in decades. You're watching Jordan TV. Very warm welcome to the news. His Majesty the King, the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces Arab Army, called on the Royal Jordanian Air Force Command. He was welcomed by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the King's Advisor for Military Affairs, General Mish'al Zabin, His Royal Highness Prince Faisal ibn Hussein, and the Royal Air Force Commander. King Abdullah was brought up to date by General Zabin on training, operational and administrative issues related to the armed forces. The Royal Air Force Commander also gave a briefing on training, operational and technical matters at the various units and bases of the Royal Air Force. King Abdullah commended the advanced level and morale of the Royal Air Force personnel. He also checked on a number of systems and aircraft that had newly been introduced into the Air Force. His Majesty the King welcomed German Defense Minister Ursula Gertraud von der Leyen and the 7-member delegation from German Parliament's Defence Committee to discuss the latest regional and international issues of mutual concern. The meeting focused on efforts by the international coalition fighting terrorism and extremism, which was strongly condemned by world leaders in Paris yesterday. His Majesty, who joined world leaders at a solidarity march in Paris, said the leaders' presence in the French capital yesterday was of paramount importance as the world stood together against terrorism and extremism and to express solidarity with the French people.
I'm delighted to have a chance to meet with you, and I had the opportunity to see the Chancellor yesterday, who was very well aware of your visit to Jordan and was hoping that I would make it back to see all of you. And our presence in Paris was very, very important because this is a united fight against terrorism and extremism. And, you know, we stood with our French colleagues because this is a stand against violence and extremism, and none of us can condone the violence and terror that we have not only witnessed in France, but recently in Canada and Australia. But also, it was also a message to stand by the many millions of French Muslims that the overwhelming majority also stand against the violence that was perpetrated in France. I think this was very, very important for all of us to come and stand together. And it's not only just what we're seeing in France. I mean, I think if you keep in mind, you know, the 140 children that were killed in Pakistan, is over 2,000 innocents that were killed in Nigeria, and thousands of Muslims that are killed in Iraq and Syria every day. So this is something that binds us all together.
The German minister said she had the chance to meet the King to discuss ties and the situation in the Middle East. She commended the level of relations between the two countries, stressing Jordan's key role in addressing regional and international issues.
It is an enormous honor for us that you take your time to receive us here. Thank you on the behalf of the members of Parliament. Yes, indeed, it was a very strong signal to see the pictures yesterday in Paris. And to see how all the responsible heads of states and governments joined in saying no to terrorism and yes to tolerance and freedom. So this was moving to see that, and I think it was a signal that was very well understood. Let me tell you that we see you as the crucial factor here in the region, you and your people and your country, because you are the link between the Western part and the Western countries and the Muslim countries, because you know both worlds.
Separately, King Abdullah received Spanish Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, José Manuel García Margallo, who is on a tour of the Middle East. During the talks at Al Husseiniya Palace, King Abdullah said Jordan is interested in strengthening ties and cooperation with Spain, mainly in the economic, trade and renewable energy fields. The king said Jordan fully backs efforts to bring about security and stability to regional countries and fight terrorism and extremism, which threaten the region and the whole world. He said all world powers and influential parties should create conditions conducive to launching Palestinian-Israeli peace talks based on the two-state solution and international legitimacy resolutions. On the regional crises, King Abdullah stressed the importance of reaching a comprehensive political solution to the Syria crisis and the need to support the Iraqi government in its fight against terrorist organizations. The Spanish minister said his country is keen to maintain close coordination with Jordan on regional issues. Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriate Affairs Nasser Jude and his Spanish counterpart discussed regional developments and growing extremism and terrorism. The minister stressed the need for a concerted world effort to confront the trend of terrorism and extremism, which has become the paramount global challenge. He said His Majesty King Abdullah's participation, along with world leaders, in a solidarity march in Paris to condemn terrorist attacks there, is an expression of Jordan's stand against terrorism. Jude and Margallo also discussed the Palestinian issue and the importance of finding a negotiated path to deal with the final status issues. In a joint press conference, García Margallo said Islam is a peaceful and tolerant religion that has nothing to do with the extremist movements we are currently witnessing. Jude thanked Madrid for its support that helped Jordan to bear the burden of receiving large numbers of Syrian refugees. The government decided to delay the start of the working day tomorrow by 2 hours due to frost formation expected in the morning hours. But the decision exempted essential staff in some key sectors and the southern city of Aqaba as well, which was largely spared by the blizzard that struck across the country, bringing chaos on roads and forcing the closure of universities and public institutions. Prime Minister Abdullah Sur instructed that work starts at 10 a.m. instead of 8 a.m. tomorrow. Some universities have also cancelled evening classes. Pope Francis commended Jordan's hospitality towards refugees coming from Middle Eastern countries. The pontiff was addressing diplomats from 180 countries accredited to the Vatican, an annual speech informally known as his State of the World Address. Father Rifat Badr, director of the Catholic Media Center in Amman, said the Pope mentioned Jordan's role after he talked about the many disasters and conflicts that took place or persisted last year. He said the Pope focused on the culture of exclusion, violence and extremism sweeping the world, particularly the Arab region. France is beefing up security, mobilizing thousands of extra troops to guard key sites after the country's worst attacks in decades. Prime Minister Manuel Valls said France will never be quite the same again after last week's attacks. World leaders joined over 1.5 million French people who poured onto the streets of Paris to mourn the 17 killed in 3 attacks. And now comes the harder task of channeling that momentum to tackle the security, judicial, social and economic problems being suggested as factors behind a threat which is still very alive. This report has more.
In newly released video, French police hurry away freed hostages from the kosher supermarket in Paris. That's where the second of 2 separate sieges by Islamist militants was underway on Friday. It was recorded just after police blew up the shop entrance and stormed inside to tackle a single gunman who had already killed 4 hostages. 2 seriously wounded on the ground, he says. In other video released by police, tactical teams prepare for the first larger siege northeast of Paris. That's where the 2 gunmen behind Wednesday's deadly attack on a satirical newspaper were holed out. Heavily armed units gather around a printing factory, planning their assault on the building and moving into positions as snipers watch. Both men were killed by police gunfire. 3 days later in Paris's Place de la République, only litter remains after Sunday's massive march against the violence. Well over 1 million people mobilized in Paris to honor the 17 victims who died in the 2 separate attacks, led by 40 world leaders locked arm in arm in an unprecedented scene. But doubts linger about how long this burst of solidarity can last.
I think we'll forget some things very quickly, and that our governments are going to go back to thinking about their personal squabbles, and that everyone will go off to their own camps again.
I was just putting on Facebook, the whole world is still with us today. But what about tomorrow? Tomorrow? No, it'll never work.
France is now preparing to deploy some 10,000 troops on home soil for added security and another 5,000 extra police to protect Jewish sites across the country, but also its mosques amid fears of further attacks.
Footage from a surveillance camera obtained by a Turkish newspaper shows the female accomplice of militants behind the Paris attacks, Hayat Boumediene, at Istanbul's airport on January the 2nd. Footage showed Boumediene wearing a white veil and accompanied by a man identified as Mahdi Sabri Bulhusseini by the police, arriving at a passport control point and going through security. The Haberturk newspaper reported she was believed to cross into Syria from the Akçakale border crossing in the southeast province of Şanlıurfa. It said the last signal from her mobile phone was received from the Syrian town on Tel El Abyad across Turkey's Akçakale crossing. Turkish Interior Minister Ifkan Ala said the suspect was not stopped upon her arrival to Turkey because there were no notice from France. The United States and its allies targeted IS militants in 27 airstrikes in Iraq and Syria in 24 hours. According to the Combined Joint Task Force, the air raids, which ran from Sunday morning to Monday morning, hit IS units and destroyed fighting positions and buildings near the Syrian city of Kobani. It said a strike near Deir ez-Zor hit an oil refinery and another near Abu Kamal destroyed an excavator. The statement said 60 strikes in Iraq destroyed fighting positions, vehicles, an artillery system, a rocket launcher and buildings. Meantime, rebel factions continued fighting across Syria. In Kobani, near the Turkish border, clashes were continuing between rebel factions. Buildings in the northern city of Aleppo collapsed by explosions caused by heavy shelling. Human Rights Monitoring Group said more than 76,000 people were killed in the Syrian civil war last year. Indonesian Navy divers retrieved the black box flight data recorder from the wreck of an AirAsia passenger jet. Recovering the data recorder was a major step towards unraveling the cause of the crash that killed all 162 people on board. But there was confusion about what happened in the final moments of Flight 8501, which crashed off the Indonesian coast late December. The second so-called black box, containing the cockpit voice recorder, is located about 20 meters away from where the flight data recorder was found. Divers have not yet been able to get to it. The black boxes contain data that will be crucial for investigators piecing together the sequence of events that led to the airliner plunging into the sea. US stocks fell today, extending a 2-week decline for equities. Weakness in oil prices weighed on the energy sector ahead of the start of the corporate earnings seasons. Oil prices continued their downward march and weighed on equities, with both Brent and US crude down about 4%. US stocks fell on Friday after the December jobs report painted a mixed picture of the economy and led to the benchmark S&P index to its second straight weekly decline. Since hitting a record high on December the 29th, the index has fallen 2.2% on concerns about global growth, the potential for an exit by Greece from the Eurozone, and falling oil prices. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell about half a percentage point. The S&P 500 lost 0.55%, and the Nasdaq Composite dropped 0.41%. One of Jordan's best-known singers, Ismail Khadr, has passed away at age 74. Khadr left behind a legacy of folklore and patriotic songs since he started his career as singer in 1962. Jordanians still remember his song collections, which praise the homeland, such as Ana الأردن, I'm Jordan, Baladi Amman, Amman is my home, and Wadda'un Wajhuka ya Baladi, among many others. Throughout his singing career, Khadr has helped to preserve the national Jordanian musical identity. The late singer had worked with famous Jordanian poets and musicians such as Haydar Mahmoud and Jamil Al-As. We begin with the Football Asian Cup in Australia. A disappointing start to Jordan's An-Nashama at the tournament after a 0-1 loss to Iraq. A magical goal from midfielder Yasser Qasim gave Iraq a crucial victory over a 10-man Jordanian squad. Although it was their first match, the stakes could not have been higher for both teams, with defending champion Japan having launched their Group D campaign with a 4-0 rout of Palestine earlier in the day. Roger Federer of Switzerland defeated Australian Leighton Hewitt 4-3, 2-4, 3-4, 4-love, 4-2 in a 5-set exhibition match played in Sydney, Australia. The match was played under the fast-4 format, in which each set is played up to 4 games with no lets, 1-point deuces, and tie-breaks up to 5 points if the set is tied at 3-3. The match was part of the build-up to the Australian Open, the first Grand Slam of 2015, which begins in Melbourne next week. Brazil and Barcelona soccer star Neymar talked about his ambitions with the Brazil team after suffering 2 of the worst defeats in World Cup's history last summer. Speaking at a news conference in Istanbul, the Brazil striker said he hoped to win the Copa America tournament, which will be held in Chile in June this year. Neymar posed with the International Royal Cup's 2015 trophy, the reason for his trip to Turkey. Now a look at the weather forecast. Very cold tonight across many regions with 0 and sub-zero temperatures and a strong chance for freezing, including the northern Jordan Valley. Winds will be southeasterly brisk, picking up at times. A slight rise in temperatures is expected tomorrow, but frigid temperatures will remain across the hilly areas, while winds will be southwesterly brisk. Fair weather is forecast for much of the Jordan Valley, with high temperatures expected to reach 19 or 20 degrees at the Dead Sea. The Port of Aqaba should expect fair conditions as well, with northerly moderate winds and slightly choppy seas. The weatherman warns of freezing and frost formation. Motorists are strongly advised not to venture out during the course of tonight and the early morning hours tomorrow as well. Next, the lows and highs for tonight and tomorrow. To close our top stories once again, His Majesty the King, the Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, is updated on the Royal Air Force's training, operational and administrative programs. In a meeting with Germany's Defense Minister, the King says the world should stand united against terrorism and extremism. And France is stepping up security after the country's worst terrorism attacks in decades. And that's the end of tonight's news. My name is Raad Liptouche. Thank you so much for your time. Have a good night.